Hello everyone, today we would like to share with you our thoughts and outline the main thesis on the book A Century of War, Anglo-American Oil Politics and the New World Order, written by William Engdahl. Let me start with the first part of the book concerning the emergence of oil and its rise as a global resource. For numerous reasons, the relevance of oil as a new global supply began to be regarded at the end of the 19th century. Before that time, England was the world's leading maritime power with a developed and stable economy and the most powerful naval ships. However, due to the development of Germany, its dominance started to decline. The Great Depression of 1873, which was a direct result of the British free trade transition, marked the start of England's crisis. The stock market crash caused chaos on England's economy. Other nations, such as Germany, implemented a series of national economic protectionist policies, allowing them to achieve the highest rates of industrial progress in the last 200 years. Germany began to grow, raising its overall production. England began to look for ways to maintain British naval supremacy. One of the first people to think about oil as a new source was Lord Fisher, who understood the importance of oil and tried to prove to his colleagues the importance of this resource. But they did not listen to him first. With the development of German naval power, England needed to make efforts for development of the maritime sphere, and it was proven by Fisher that petroleum-powered ships are much more powerful than those powered by coal while using less manpower to work. England began building ships powered by oil, and thus oil became a new world resource that the world powers began to hunt for. Let me now talk about the period when oil actually became the weapon and the time when the rivalry between the United States and Britain reached its momentum. The conflict between Germany and England continued to grow. In an effort to win more oil, prosperous Germany has established relations with the Middle East. Their plans included the construction of a railway from Berlin to Baghdad. However, England expressed a sharp protest as it understood that oil would not be transported by water but by land, so they could not allow this. Despite the fact that Germany itself offered to cooperate with England in the construction of the railway, the British government was categorically against this idea. During World War II, oil became crucial to the warring countries. It became the recognized key to the success of the revolution in military strategy because it was needed for air power, tank and naval warfare. Thus, a reliable supply of new fuel became increasingly necessary. The struggle of the Nazis was directly related to oil production. For example, they wanted the territories of Baku and the Caspian Sea of Tsarist Russia, as that was where a large amount of this raw material was found. After the war, the following decade saw a fierce struggle between the combined but conflicting objectives of Britain and the United States. Now I would like to outline the thesis concerning the role of Marshall Plan. Little attention has been paid to the role of oil in the post-war European Recovery Program, better known as the Marshall Plan. From its inception in 1947, the largest single expenditure by ERP recipient countries in Western Europe was to use Marshall Plan dollars to purchase oil, which could be supplied primarily by American oil companies. After the war, Big Oil, as the 5 US companies were called, moved to take decisive control of Europeans' post-war petroleum markets. The consequence of war had severely harmed European dependence on coal as the energy source. One more topic I would like to cover is the European threat to American oil hegemony. While Washington had initially encouraged the creation of a European common market in order to provide a more efficient market for American industrial and capital exports, the last thing certain circles in the Anglo-American establishment wanted was a politically and economically independent continental Europe. When the United States entered the first phase of a deep, long-lasting post-war economic recession in late 1957, with resulting industrial stagnation and rising unemployment, a recession that lasted into the early 1960s problem took on a dangerous new twist. The United States in the late 1950s faced the demand of a huge reinvestment into its productive labor force, education system, and technology base, if it were to continue to be the world's leading industrial economy. By early 1957, for the first time since the Second World War, funds began to flow out of the United States in amounts greater than those coming in. The American banks secretly pushed on Washington. Rather than investing the profits in American development, they kept their money in Europe, and this marked the start of what became known as the euro-dollar market.
After the end of the Second World War liberated Europe was a devastation. From Marshall Plan of 1947, the largest single expenditure by European Recovery Program, receiving countries in Western Europe was to use Marshall Plan dollars to purchase oil supplied primarily by American oil companies. After the war, the 5 US companies moved to take decisive control of Europe's post-war petroleum markets. The adoption of the Marshall Plan marked the beginning of US dominance in the world, both politically and economically. Markets on the European continent brought America not only super profits, but also enormous political influence. The American oil monopoly ended in the middle of the 1950s when large oil from the Persian Gulf countries came to the continent. One European company expressed interest in purchasing oil from Italy. Enrico Mattei set out to create indigenous energy resources to begin the reconstruction of Italy's post-war economy and refuse the Marshall Plan. To his mind, the term Seven Sisters means that 7 Anglo-American companies accurately accused of purchasing a worldwide policy of limiting production to maintain the highest prices for the holdings and selling their crude to oil-poor Europe at prices reached to match the high cost of production in the United States. In 1949, the first oil in Italy was found. Enrico acknowledged the need to ensure uninterrupted supplies of oil from abroad. He was too ambitious, and it was impossible for American dominance in global oil trade to smear him. The only suitable option in that case is just to kill him and destroy him at all. According to the dramatic industrial and trade growth in continental Europe, European trade relations were the developing factor. Also, expansion significantly beginning in the late 1950s leads to a more rapid industrial growth in many developing nations than at any time during the century. When de Gaulle was brought back to power in France in 1958, this gave a strong new political voice to the economically expanding European continent. He initiated an independent French nuclear force, the Frappe, and announced it was withdrawing its Mediterranean naval fleet from the NATO command. De Gaulle was articulating a new independent voice for the emerging post-war continental Europe. Increasingly, after the crisis of 1957, large US industries and banks began to follow the British model of industrial policy. American automatic steel turnover rates dropped significantly. Europe was suffering a huge shortage of capital because of the war and the collapse of industry. Obviously, the rise in oil prices played an important role in this process and not only reflects the weak position of the dollar. The Anglo-American counterattack succeeded and de Gaulle was out of office and French voice was weakened respectively. Germany or France would have much less difficulty in finding their domestic resources to pay for oil imports in Dutch marks or francs without pre-buying dollars for the same purpose. This circumstance makes the decision of the OPEC ministers at the 1975 meeting not to accept anything other than the US dollar for payment for oil supplies, not to accept even the British pound sterling, and the crash of 1978 began to escalate. In 1973, there was the first world energy crisis, which is still considered the largest in the history. Firstly, in October of 1973, the Fourth Arab-Israeli War broke out. All in all, the forces of Israel and its allies retook their positions. In response to American and European arms supplies to Israel, OPEC took unprecedented measures at all. It stopped supplying oil to the United States and Europe. Secondly, the measures introduced instantly revealed the dependence of the Western economy on the main energy resource, and caused an oil shock. Seeing this, the Arab states, in the coalition with the countries of the Persian Gulf, agreed to increase oil prices. Speaking about possible outcomes, firstly, the collapse of the UK and French stock markets in France, the number of bankruptcies in 1974 exceeded last year's figures by a third. Secondly, the total reduction in the industry of the leading European countries. A group called Friends of the Earth was created, and one of the earliest actions of Anderson's Friends of the Earth was an assault on the German nuclear industry. For such anti-nuclear actions as an anti-Brockdorf demonstrations in 1976, led by Friends of the Earth leader Holger Strom. It was Friends of the Earth which was used to block a major Japanese-Australian revenue supply agreement. One of the most targeted countries for this new Anglo-American anti-nuclear offensive was Germany.
In this part, I'm going to talk about the new US policy in the new millennium. So, after George Bush took the presidential office, all his campaign was aimed to reinstitute US energy policy as the main factor of domination of the US for all over the world. Dick Cheney, who was the vice president, some years before George Bush took a presidential office in 1999, in the meeting in the London with several English establishment and English oil companies, he predicted that the Middle East would become a new ground and zone for contestment between US and other countries for oil fields. But in that time it seemed as a conspiracy theory, but some years later it became clearly understood by everyone that these words were close to reality. So after George Bush, after 9/11, which was turning point for the US foreign policy, after 9/11, Iran was accused by America as the main sponsor of world terrorism. And world terrorism became a new threat for America instead of communism, because USSR dissolved 10 years before that. And after 9/11, George Bush, in his presidential speech, he introduced the new term for he introduced the new term for American enemies, axis of evil, instead of empire of evil. Empire of evil was Soviet Union, but after dissolution, the new axis of evil were North Korea, Iran, and Iraq. So after he introduced this statement, firstly, Iran was invaded by American forces because Iran, as I said, was accused by America as the main sponsor of world terrorism, and the invasion of American forces to Iran was against the UN Charter, but UN, for some reason, just postponed this question. And when Iranian government was toppled and the regime of Saddam Hussein was overthrown by American invasion, the main excuse for American invasion to Iran was firstly defense of the democracy, and second to defeat all world terrorists. But this invasion was a turning point for all Middle East countries, because in the beginning of the new millennium, Taliban in Afghanistan took a power and overthrown the previous government. And America, instead to overthrow Taliban as the terrorist group, it tried to sign an agreement to place a pipeline through the Afghanistan to China and to further Asian continent. But Taliban instead set an ultimatum that either we will use this pipeline also for our needs, for our infrastructure, or we wouldn't let you to put this pipeline through our country. But America also set an ultimatum, and which stated the next: either you accept our terms, or we will bomb you. Taliban refused to accept, and after it, America just invaded Afghanistan and overthrown Taliban government. So again, this question was about the establishment of new state, the new puppet regime in the state of the Middle East to acquire new oil fields. And all US policy in the Middle East in the beginning of the new millennium can be described similar. The Middle East countries were invaded by America, and there were two main excuses, as I've said yet. Firstly, defense of the democracy, and the second one, defeating world terrorists, which were seen as humanitarian grounds for establishment a new regime, a better regime for all citizens of these countries. But in reality, this policy was aimed to acquire as more oil fields as American companies and American establishments can.